What are we here for? It all begins with Jesus' words. You know these verses from Matthew 28. He said, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you." So Jesus calls us two things. First of all, to be a disciple, and then to make a disciple. That's basically what we do. I like making things simple because I am a simple guy in understanding and knowing that. But did you know that over 400 years, some world travelers arrived on the East Coast? A lot of you are world travelers. And they established what we know as the New England colonies. They began there. So first year, they established a town site. Second year, I don't know what was wrong with them, but they elected a town government. Third year, the town government planned to open a road 5 miles inland into the wilderness. The fourth year, they must be related to folks today, they wanted to impeach their government. Because who would want to go 5 miles into the wilderness? Yet here's these people that had traveled thousands of miles, crossed the Atlantic, came to a new land nobody had seen or been before, and then all of a sudden they got very comfortable because they'd lost their vision. They'd lost their purpose, and they weren't pioneers anymore because they just settled here and they didn't want to do anything. And it's very easy to lose our focus because it's very comfortable living in the United States. What are we here for? So if I could take for a minute a very familiar passage, you find it in Luke chapter 4 when Jesus reads from the scrolls in the synagogue, but I'm going to read the passage from Isaiah that he read from. It's chapter 61, the first 3 verses. It said, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me because the Lord anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, the release from darkness for the prisoners, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, and to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of the spirit of despair." The passage, if you could say, was Jesus' commencement address, his mission statement. That was the beginning of his public ministry. He lists 6 items I want us to touch for a couple minutes. Don't have much time to do all, but the main one is the first one. Preach good news to the poor. What are we here for? You and I, regardless of our role in life, are to be evangelists. Share the good news, preach the good news to those who are poor in spirit. Basically, it's anybody who doesn't have Jesus, or has a misconception of who Jesus is, or who needs the clarity to realize it's all been taken care of. We have to tell them the price has been paid. We're not called to just sit and encourage one another, although that's good and necessary. We're not called to build huge buildings, even though those are necessary at times as well. And we're not called to grow each other into spiritually fat children of God. Though teaching and ministry to one another are vitally important, what we're called to do is preach the good news, especially to those who don't know Jesus. Everything else is secondary to that. Second thing he talks about is healing the brokenhearted. Love the story of him coming up to the funeral procession and stopping it. Can you imagine him stopping a hearse today and telling him to pull the casket out? Because that's basically what he says. And it's the widow of Nain and her only son. And Jesus does something very interesting. What's he do? Brings him back to life. Wow. I love what the people said afterwards. They said, God has come to help us today. First time I was ever at a maximum security was just a couple hours north of here in Lompoc. I hope none of you have ever been to jail, but that's not a fun one to go to. It was rather scary. We went with our young adult team from the church in Long Beach when I was in college. And what they didn't tell us until afterwards, that because of a riot, the inmates had been locked in their cells for 3 weeks. And the first time out was the concert that we were doing for them. Oh, it was crazy. As soon as they opened the door, they came running in, but they didn't stop at the front row. They ran right up and sat on the floor, on the platform right next to us. And it was rather scary. But you know how God did miracles? Prepared me, because then you fast forward years later, we're in Mar del Plata, and we get a call one night because they were having riots at the women's jail. And wouldn't you know it, as God has things on, one of the guards was a member of our church and says, oh, just call our pastors. They would come and take care of it. Now, that's not a word from the Lord. At least I didn't think so at that time. So Ahmad and I were called there. We walked in and cat calls, yelling stuff. I mean, it was crazy. So we just began to pray in the Spirit. What else do you do? And about 20 minutes later, everything was quiet. The warden was wondering what's going on. Ahmad and I took turns doing 2-minute messages because both of us were scared to death, and prayed sinner's prayer. We didn't know what happened that night, but several of them gave their hearts to Christ. Long story shorter, the warden built a chapel for us there in the center courtyard of the prison where our teams from our church would go every week. But it started with that because there's brokenhearted people that need help. Comfort those who are hurting, Jesus said. I'm so glad we're part of City Serve. Every week, teams of our churches are going out doing amazing things. He said to rebuild broken lives. David was a teller at a local bank here in Orange County, got caught embezzling money from the bank. Lost his job, obviously. Sometime later, he got hired at one of the local supermarkets, and he proceeded, I don't know how he did it, but he stole $26,000 from the supermarket. Obviously, he was caught. His parents were asked to make restitution for that, and he got off his jail time, was put on probation. In desperation, because he couldn't find a job, stole a car and drove to Vegas with what little money he had, thinking he could hit it rich and make up some of that money. Well, lost it all, got drunk, and turned himself into the police, because that way he'd have a place to stay. And now he definitely couldn't get a job. So on the street again for a few days, hungry because he had no money, had no way to get back to Orange County, found the mission. And they had free food, except he had to listen to a sermon. But found out that his problem was not just the addictions and other things he'd been involved in, but it was a sin problem. Well, he gave his heart to Christ. Long story short, today he's the assistant director of the mission, helping with job training for other people caught in the same type of thing. Rebuilding broken lives. And lastly, Jesus said we're here to enable all to serve. Each of us have been called to serve. One of our themes is to empower. That's what we do. But it all starts with reach. And my challenge to you this morning is to help us to see those around us. You probably don't realize, maybe you do, but if you don't see it every day, all the world religions have come to Southern California, and they're around you and they need Jesus desperately.